the Prosecutor of the Year. The Prosecutor of the Year by the Mass District Attorneys Association. And so she is the first woman in the history of Suffolk County to ever win that award, and I am very, very proud of her. She is an exceptional litigator and prosecutor. And additionally, 7 of my 9 supervising assistant district attorneys in the district and municipal courts in Suffolk County are women. 8 of the 15 chiefs in my superior courts are women. And we are also represented in Massachusetts by some incredibly strong advocates at the federal level. Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley is the first Black woman to ever be a congressional representative from our district or our Commonwealth, and Senator Elizabeth Warren is the first female senator. So even as glass ceilings are shattering, women continue, unfortunately, to be, experiencing forms of sexual and emotional abuse at incredibly alarming rates. Today, we are joined by 3 exceptional panelists, including 2 women of color that do not work in my office, but we have great relationships with, and Ian Pallabaum, who does work in our office and is an exceptional lawyer that has handled some of our most high-profile homicide cases since I've been fortunate enough to be the DA. So I'm going to introduce all 3 of them quickly, and then we're going to get to the questions. So Carew Pitch has been at Harbor Cove since its founding in 1998, when she joined as the Cambodian advocate for that organization. Since then, she has served as the Director of Community Services and as the co-executive director of this organization since 2008. Carew works in a shared leadership model at Harbor Cove with Lynn, and together they oversee nearly 30 full and part-time direct service, fiscal, administrative, and operational staff members and consultants. She served on the Jane Doe Inc. Board of Directors for 7 years and as the president of that entity in 2012 and 13. She's also been a consultant for the Women of Color Network since 2011, providing anti-oppression technical assistance to domestic and sexual violence coalitions across the country, and supports its national leadership project. Carew's work experience includes rape crisis counseling at the former Greater Lowell Rape Crisis Center. Thank you for joining us, Carew. Katia Santiago Taylor is the Boston Rape Crisis Center, BARC's, policy director. She advocates for systems-wide policy changes to support survivors and manages BARC's work on legislation that impacts survivors. Katia's worked in the field of domestic and sexual violence since 1999. Before joining BARC, she worked in various positions at the Massachusetts Office of Victim Assistance, MOVA, and also as a victim witness advocate for both the Suffolk and Middlesex District Attorney's Office. Thank you for your service. Born and raised in Puerto Rico, Katia has a master's degree from Northeastern University in criminal justice. And last but certainly not least, Ian Pallabaum. Ian went to UMass Amherst and the University of Wisconsin Law School. He started working in this office in 1998 and has served under 3 elected and 2 appointed district attorneys. His assignments were as a line prosecutor for 7 years in the domestic violence unit, 2 years in the senior trial unit, and a decade in the homicide unit. Since 2015, Ian has been the chief of domestic violence and sexual assault units within our office. Those units review approximately 700 cases a year for potential superior court prosecution. The most serious domestic violence cases referred from the Chelsea and Boston municipal courts, and every adult sexual assault case reported in our jurisdiction, including domestic, acquaintance, and stranger cases. So we have an awesome panel here. I am going to put the first question to Katia, if I could, and then we'll go to Carew and then Ian. And if you guys could have about a minute each where you can talk so we can get through some of them and have everyone hear each of your amazing opinions. So what trends, Katia, have you seen in sexual and domestic violence since the pandemic started? Have you seen any?
Oh, I have seen a lot, but just wanted to actually take a second and say like Congresswoman Presley once said, women of color have cement ceilings. You are first elected woman of color, Peru. You're the ED of an organization. I'm in a position, so we're shattering cement ceilings, not glass ceilings. So thank you to both of you. So what trends? When we think about the pandemic, we know that the pandemic is affecting all of us in one way, but we also know that the pandemic is affecting to survivors of trauma and people in general. So we have different issues like the lack of access to food, the lack of housing insecurity. We have the survivorship, the economic impact. We have the lack of access to healthcare. All of that has affected survivors of sexual violence, in particular survivors of sexual violence and domestic violence who are people of color at a significant higher rate. And we have had different levels of trauma. When we think about sexual violence, we also think about trying to heal from the trauma of the assault itself. And then we add all of, again, economic housing insecurity, economic impact. We have the lack of healthcare, the lack of the isolation, and all of that is making our process of healing a lot more difficult, and is destroying survivors. It's making it extremely difficult for survivors to just heal from the trauma or just heal from the assault. When I think about survivors and what we're going through, is like this brick wall, and not only do we have a brick wall, but each of us has different bricks. And in the trauma that we're experiencing for the pandemic, and if you add being a person of color, our brick wall is significantly higher than others. And it's going to crumble. It's going to crumble soon if it hasn't crumbled yet. When it comes to sexual violence in particular, again, homelessness, housing, and hunger are the major things, and not being able to access the emergency room for evidence collection kits. You're muted.
My dear, apologies. Karu, do you see any, have you seen trends in sexual and domestic violence since the pandemic started?
Yes, thank you so much, District Attorney Rollins, for having me here. Definitely. So we are based in Chelsea. We work with survivors from Chelsea, East Boston, Revere, Winthrop, and Charlestown. But mostly, we have seen a tremendous impact during this pandemic as we work with survivors with low to no income and immigrants. Um, One of which that we have seen, what Kathy has already been stated, is that their lack of housing, also food security. Not on top of that, survivors are also facing with some technology challenges with technology. Most of the immigrant survivor children don't have access to technologies, so that's been a factor as well. And also, most of the survivors that we are working with who are seeking shelters at the time or during the pandemic, they are at a higher risk of domestic violence homicide because the lack of housing and food security, it forced survivors to double up. And when there's violence, and it is, and also most of them are essentials worker, so they not just experiencing the violence at home, but also the impact of the pandemic. They lose their housing, they lost their um, um, employment, and also because they are essential worker, they also are forced to go to work.
Yeah.
They can't, when the state is locked down, they can't stay home, and if they stay home, they're not safe, right? So it's a ripple effects of our survivors, and most of whom also contracted the virus, and it creating even more the kind of trauma that they have to experience um, on top of domestic violence. It's just such a layer of everything else.
Yeah.
That's what we have seen.
Okay, Ian, do you see any trends that are different than what Katya and Karu, or adding to anything they've said?
I don't see any trends that are different. I mean, we're on the we're in a position where we're trying to serve people who are facing even more challenges like this, and the kind of unspoken so far challenges is a lot of the same people who face these challenges normally also have reasons, both individually and historically, not to necessarily trust our system and the police that we work with. It makes it all the more challenging and important for us to try to reach across that gap. It's easy for us in these jobs to talk about ourselves, and we could do that all night, talk about how we've responded by, reaching out to survivors, setting up Zoom meetings, and being proud that in some cases they're actually better than and more connecting than a phone call because you see faces, about setting up a grand jury so we can actually prepare people to come in live and testify and move some of the most serious cases of violence along. And a grand jury, by the way, with an incredibly good medical safety record in terms of avoiding exposures and more illness, in terms of finding ways to connect and getting people to still obtain restraining orders, whether it's going to court or whether it's doing it remotely. We have to realize, though, when we're patting ourselves on the back for taking these measures and being proactive and innovative, that it's the tip of the iceberg, and it's only a reaction that we have to do because of the challenges everyone out there is facing. And I'm not, in terms of trends in the pandemic, I'm not going to attempt numbers because compared to Luke, at least, I would fall on my face doing that. But obviously, the immediate effect was people being inside and cut off from services, and in seriously violent situations, being literally cut off from escape, being cut off from being able to get help either from people they trust somewhere or the system, including us and the police that they hope to trust. And the police didn't stop doing their jobs answering the calls. The nurses in the hospitals didn't stop doing their jobs even for a minute doing sexual assault exams and collecting evidence. And we didn't stop prosecuting cases and making decisions. But again, the challenges we face in doing that are only a reflection and are much less than the challenges out there people face in terms of being connected and not being isolated by these additional conditions that make people both feel less safe and actually be less safe.
Yeah. Can I ask, so let's, Karu, go to you. Trans women are often omitted from the conversation, and we have seen an alarming trend across our country of the murder of many trans women and our entire country, including, parts of we've seen it in Puerto Rico, we've seen it all across the United States. Can you talk to us about the work that your organization is doing? And maybe, Ian, we can next go to you. I know some of the cases that we've prosecuted where there have been sort of hate crimes or involvement with respect to certain populations. Happily, we have not had any homicides here since I've been district attorney, but Karu, can you talk to us a little bit about the trans population?
Sure. District Attorney Roland. So as we all know, trans women of color also face the higher rates of violence and have the least access to support resources. So what we have done, we work with specific, we collaborate with the Network Lorette, who provide domestic violence support for LGBTQ community, and we build specific housing that really supporting trans women in our community. We provide, we work collaboratively to provide co-advocacy with the trans women who are survivors of domestic violence by providing we call it wrap-around support, and our staff really go above and beyond to really support the survivor because we know that trans women don't always have the freedom to just walk out of the door and go to the grocery without being criticized, looked at, and also getting, it's like targeted violently. So we have to make sure that their money for transportation, there's money for medication, their fund for all kinds of support that they need, to make sure that we can remove all of those barriers. Even in the security, we want to make sure that they have their own room so that they can fully be themselves, that are not being criticized or um, creating more barrier, that we creating more barrier for the survivors.
Yeah, and I mean, just even looking at just some of the ignorance that, you know, we're seeing in comments now, right? There's this
Right.
entitlement where people feel as if they have every right to voice their opinion, but no one else has a right to be who they are or to live their truth. And, you know, I certainly, I think it's more of a commentary on the sad state of affairs of the people that feel compelled, or the only thing they have in their life is wanting to attend events to hear about all of the wonderful work my amazing doing right now. So, you know, we are very happy to talk about the LGBTQIA plus community. We are proud to be allies and unindicted co-conspirators for them. And the people that are bigoted and living in hate, and closed-minded and probably closeted themselves can keep their comments there. Katia, do you have any statements with respect to trans women being omitted from the conversation? And can you tell us about your work with trans women and maybe trends you're seeing there?
Absolutely. So we know that about 47% of respondents to a transgender survey stated that they have faced sexual assault in their lifetime. So almost half percent. BARC as an agency, we support survivors. We support all survivors, including transgender people. We also know that just like that chat, those are the services that many survivors face. I personally remember going to an emergency room about 5 years ago, and I supported a trans woman. And it was really difficult for that person to communicate with a medical staff that was collecting the evidence, and even with the misuse of proper pronouns. We have a medical staff that's trying to collect evidence from a woman, but has to do different steps. So they face extremely difficult challenges. Their head consistently, their head in, I shouldn't use bad language. Their face very challenges, and what they face is a lot more difficult than what I would face if it was in that situation. When it comes to BARC specifically, this month we're going to start our first virtual counseling group specifically for transgender and non-binary survivors. We are so excited that this is just going to be just for them, so we can address their unique needs. And we welcome inclusivity, and we're here to support people in the greater Boston area.
Excellent. And Ian, are you seeing any trends there? I don't know if this is Ursula's category or maybe Dana's with respect to hate crimes, but have you seen any trends?
Well, Dia Rollins, you're correct that our unit doesn't handle hate crimes per se, but I mean, my saying that we in our unit have seen very few cases with trans victims, I don't think that can give us any illusion that it's not happening. It's obviously happening a lot and disproportionately, and the low number of reports of sexual assault and other kinds of abuse that reach us, I think it's safe to call those a symptom, and a symptom of the barriers. To put it simply, if somebody, as one of the panelists just said, is apprehensive about just going to the grocery store based on how they might be treated, then how's that person going to walk into a police station and talk about one of the most awful moments of their lives in graphic detail, and then talk to police officers, and then talk to us, and then possibly go into court and have their whole validity questioned? In terms of our approach to it, I mean, what it means is that it makes it all the more important to go into things with an open mind and not judging people. And that's, I mean, a lot of people talk about gay and lesbian survivors or trans survivors as people who choose their lifestyle, who make some kind of choice and bring things on themselves. And that's the attitudes that people deal with. And it's judgmental. And what it tells us is if somebody has a life experience or an identity that's different from what we may be used to, that doesn't mean we dismiss it or shy away from it. That means we work even harder to listen to them. I will never say to somebody whose experience is different from mine, I know how you feel, because I don't. All I can say, and all the people I supervise and work with can say, is we respect it, tell us more. We try to appreciate it, and we try to help you.
Yeah, it's just, I think we have to stand up when there's ignorance and when people are mocking and just cowards, right? I mean, there's the one thing that is deeply troubling about Zoom is these sort of fake people who think that they're so much more important when they have a photo of somebody else and they're able to type something or say something behind closed doors or whisper it. Well before all of this, 80% of people are cowards. They can't look you in the face themselves and say it without, I don't know, turning red, fainting, pretending they're someone else. But I think what is really important to me is that, there is a validation of we don't get to choose our victims, right? No matter what they are, no matter what their background is, no matter whether they come to us having assumed risk or none at all, we are going to stand and assist them in the process, and they need to be treated with dignity and respect, no matter how they come to us, right? At all. So I think, I want to, people use the word sort of survivor centered a lot. I'd love it if maybe Katya, you could explain, what does it mean to be survivor centered, and how do we address privacy concerns that a lot of people have about when they come forward regarding some of these horrific situations. And so, for example, even with COVID, when we see that school and work used to be a respite for some people, right? Because if the abuse is in your home, when you go to school, you have a teacher, you have somebody who works in your the cafeteria somewhere that sees you and says, Karu looks different today. What's going on with you? Or they notice not just a manifestation of the harm, but maybe some other thing. We didn't get any of that now, right? And we've seen in Boston public schools, 20% of the kids haven't even logged on to classes, right? So there is not this kind of site there. But what do you do about privacy concerns? And can you explain to us when we talk about survivor-centered, what does that mean?
I want to start with the survivor center approach because, especially when it comes to sexual violence, it's a crime that's got done to one person. However, the harm is done to that person and the community in general. Sexual violence harms the community. It's not just one survivor. And until we can end sexual violence, until we can end domestic violence, we're not going to have a healthy community. And how can we do that? We can do it by prevention, right? We can focus on making sure that we have housing, that we have education, that we have access to resources. And if we try to separate ourselves from the harm that's done to one other person, we're really not engaging with the community. We're not an active participant of healing, an active participant of having a safe community. When it comes to Survivor Center in a specific case, again, we need to address the specific needs of that person. What I need is going to be very different than what Karu needs or what you need, DA Rollins. So we need to focus on that person, believe them, and think about all of the aspects that they bring to that scenario. Because like Ian said, we may have had the same situation, but we're going to respond, react, and heal differently. And we need to focus on people's healing. And healing looks differently to every single person. We know that sexual violence is the most underreported and underprosecuted crime, and that is okay because it's a choice that the survivor made. And they're looking for different ways to heal. The criminal legal system is not the option for everyone, and as long as we understand that there's different results, different services, different approaches, trauma informed, restorative justice. As long as we allow that for the survivor, we're going to be focusing on the survivor. When it comes to privacy, privacy is complicated, right? Especially with Zoom, bombarded chat. If you're home, you can't even have a non-web based doctor's appointment nowadays. So what we try to do is to really focus on safety planning with survivors. We try to focus safety planning and try to figure out alternative ways to communicate and to know when it's safe to ask for help. We have a chat line, we have a hotline. We're still hospitals still available for survivors. It's just trying to become creative during the pandemic. And I said, I think at the beginning of the pandemic, we were trying to figure out how to do all of our services remote instead of focusing on the type of new services that people were needing. And we're getting there. Like we're learning. It's been a year. We better have learned of what are the needs of survivors and how to address them. BARC is open virtually, and we actually do in-office visits. We'll meet with survivors in office if needed.
Okay, so we are a little bit over. I want to give I want to give one more question if I can, and to Karu, and then Ian, if we can wrap up with you. Karu, what work, if any, are you doing? And it is not always men, but it is, if we look at statistics, it is overwhelmingly men, but not always, or responsible parties. What work do you do with them? Because there's this sort of cancel culture of, if you engage in harm, yes, you'll be held responsible, but what happens after that? How does somebody, how does somebody have some sort of a, I don't know, like rehabilitation or re-entry back into the world? What does that look like?
So I also want to briefly talk about when it comes to domestic violence, it's not us and them. It's not like survivor and us. Any one of us can be a survivor of domestic violence, right? So, and the majority of the survivor we are working with, their abuser are men. So, in order to kind of, how do we overcome that? How do we address domestic violence? So Habuko looking at a domestic violence as a whole community context, and we invited men, especially men in leadership position. I call leadership position men who's holding powers like police chief, fire chief, principal, probate chief, to come together to help us address the violence against women and children, and how do we work together to overcome that, and really we're not looking at like good men, bad men. We're looking at a socialization of manhood. How can men who holding leadership position or men in community challenge the violence act or challenge domestic violence? And how can we work together? How can we support survivor? And then really looking at doing some of your own work, like looking at a self-reflection. How did I contribute to violence against women? And then working toward institutional change as a whole. So, and kind of deepen a really self-reflective and learning ourselves, as well as being part of an institutional change as well.
Perfect. I love it. Ian, as we wrap up, what is one thing you want the community to walk away with today from this conversation that we've had?
Okay, well, first, thanks everybody for coming. I'm trying to visualize a big room full of people. I'm sure we all miss that. I hope enough people are sensible and safe out there on a national and world level that we get there. We know that the criminal system is not the only way for people to heal, and it's not the way that everybody chooses to help them heal. But it's what we do, obviously. We prosecute cases. We deal with the most significant public or personal safety threats in the context of violence against women. And so we want people to know when they're in crisis that we'll listen, that we'll do our best to understand your situation, that we will be transparent, because one of the hardest parts of our jobs is making tough decisions and explaining them to people, especially when we are either using our legal powers either more aggressively or less aggressively than somebody wants us to, ranging anywhere from there's somebody we really feel poses a significant safety threat and we're asking a judge to incarcerate that person, and that may not be what that person's family wants, and we have to be upfront and explain it. And at the other end, if somebody is reporting a sexual assault and for whatever reason it's not a case that we are prosecuting, we have to be transparent about that and explain that, and not make that decision arbitrarily. Go into it with an open mind, question our own assumptions. But above all, I mean, going back to what the question to elsewhere on the panel of what does it mean to be survivor centric. It means understanding that people respond to trauma and the worst moments of their lives in different ways than we think we might if it happened to us. And to be transparent about our decisions. And most of all, again, to listen. I can still say after more than 20 years, I learn something new on this job every day. And the minute that doesn't happen is when I don't do it anymore. But it's still happening. So thanks, everybody.
Excellent. So Ian, Karu, Katia, I want to thank you guys. Karu and Katia are our community partners. Ian, as you know, works in the office. I also want to thank you, Luke, for your data, and our great community engagement team with Ricky and Danielle, as well as Jorge and Amanda, and then Josh, who did all of our IT work. I want to sort of wrap up by saying, you know, as a woman elected official, it is still very sad that, unlike men, you know, we have, as we said, you know, people who comment on our appearance, people who make disparaging comments about our very beings. And as women, we are still held to different standards. In National Women's Month, I was and am hopeful that we are going to see more leaders who are brave and who are willing to, in the face of that type of additional nonsense that we have to deal with while doing our job that our male counterparts very often do not, that